Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethics 243, Business Ethics. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about corporate social responsibility. The main question of today's lecture will be something like, what do businesses owe, and to whom do they owe it? First, I want to make note that your first writing assignment has been released either late last week or early this week. And with it, a video that explains and breaks down the assignment has been released. That is the 4-sentence essay assignment. It is literally an essay in which you write 4 sentences. I go into it in greater detail there. That essay will be due in either July 7th or a little later in the week, like July 11th. I'll have to make that determination still. Then we're going to talk about the economic view of corporate social responsibility, the stakeholder view, and then your discussion prompt will have to do with the case of Walmart this week. All right, so corporate social responsibility. One of the main subjects in ethics has to do with what our moral responsibilities are as individuals. What do we owe to each other? What does the state owe us? What does the state owe to those who we disagree with? And what do we owe ourselves? The 2 questions that we'll focus on today are these. First, morally speaking, what do businesses and those acting on behalf of businesses owe, morally speaking, to others? And 2, to whom do businesses and those acting on behalf of businesses have a moral obligation? So, what are the obligations and to whom are we obligated if we're acting on behalf of a business? One very influential view in the history of ethical thought on business and corporations is what we call the economic view, or the shareholder view. According to the economic view, businesses have an obligation only to their shareholders, that is, the owners, boards, committees, and shareholders of a business. So according to the economic view, businesses have 2 obligations, morally speaking, and only 2. First, do not act against the interests of the shareholders. That is, don't cheat them, don't steal from them, don't sell them out, don't sell their trade secrets, and so on. And 2, maximize shareholder profits. Absolutely do what you can to maximize those profits. The only 2 moral obligations you have are these 2, and they are both obligations to the shareholders. But this view faces many challenges. The economic view says that the only morally significant relationship a business has is to its shareholders. But there seem to be many counterexamples. Consider, for example, Walmart Mexico's corruption scandal. Walmart representatives had paid more than $24 million in bribes to Mexican officials to promote expansion of Walmart throughout Mexico. When this was investigated internally, Walmart executives killed the investigation until it was determined that journalists were going to go public about corporate malpractice anyway. At that point, Walmart issued a statement condemning the issue, but their actions reveal, or seem to reveal, that they had no intention of stopping the action so long as they weren't shared or weren't caught. In this way, the actions, the bribes in South America and in Mexico were at the interests of the shareholders. They were Central America, not South America. They were in the interests of the shareholders, but they seemed illegal and immoral. So what should the economic view say about this? Well, to understand what the economic view should say about it, we should understand one of the main justifications for the economic view. So what is the main justification for the economic view of corporate social responsibility? Well, according to Milton Friedman, one of the more influential and well-known economists who has defended the economic view, quote, "The view has been gaining widespread acceptance that corporate officials have a social responsibility that goes beyond serving the interests of their stockholders. This view shows a fundamental misconception of the character and nature of a free economy. In such an economy, there is one and only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources and engage in activity designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game." So what does this tell us? Well, the first thing that it tells us is that Friedman's view, the economic view, holds that there's only one kind of moral responsibility, that all the other kinds are mistaken. And it justifies that on the basis of some ideal about what a free economy looks like. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's worth noting that at the end of this, Milton Friedman qualifies his claim. It's not just maximize social responsibility. It's, we can call it the economic view starred, or the qualified economic view, which I'll just refer to as the economic view from now on. The only responsibility of businesses is to maximize profits within the rules of the game, where the game is a way of referencing the regulative structure imposed by governments or international law or other forms of regulation. So let's return to the case of Walmart Mexico. Walmart Mexico is a case where $24 million in bribes were paid. That certainly seems like a case where people were acting outside the law. Okay, so the action was illegal, immoral, and therefore was something that the government or the corporation should not have engaged in. Okay. So we have this qualified version, which is meant to defend and fix the problem that is raised by the Walmart Mexico cases. But there are further challenges to even this qualified version of the economic view. For example, what about cases where the rules of the game themselves are unjust? Sure, Mexico's bribery laws were morally fine, but historically, it's been legal to deny business on the basis of race, for example, and illegal to protect Jews from the Nazis or to help slaves escape their masters. And yet, we do think that discrimination on the basis of race is immoral, that the Holocaust was immoral, and that slavery was immoral, and that even it was morally good to help Jews escape and slaves escape. Does this mean then that the qualified economic view says that businesses can engage in these practices so long as they're legal? Surely it's not okay to be racist just because you're a business, right? So typically, when you ask a question like this, we're worried that a view proves too much or claims too much. In this case, the view would prove too much. It would claim too much by claiming that all of these actions which are clearly immoral are wrong. And that would be a problem for the economic view as a view of business ethics. But the proponents of the economic view have a response to this, right? They might reply as follows. Look, I'm not morally okay with slavery or anti-Semitism or racism or whatever. But the role of business in a free market economy is to maximize the interests of the shareholders within the limits of law set by the state. So if something is super immoral but profitable, you shouldn't blame the businesses. They're just doing their job. You should ask the state to set better limits. They might also add, and plus, what's immoral is often bad for business, because it's bad for public relations. So we have good reasons to avoid it anyway. Understood in this way, the qualified economic view relies on a specific conception of the economic view as justified by a further conception, an ideal of a free market economy. Okay? Just like Friedman suggested earlier. What's the idea behind this response? Well, the idea is basically this, right? Look, we don't like it any more than you do, but I'm just a representative of this business, and my job is just to maximize shareholder value, maximize the outputs for the shareholder. As a result, sometimes I'm going to do things which look like they're a problem for society. I can agree that those things are bad, but really the solution to these immoral things is not to make it so that is not to make it so that it's the business's responsibility, but it's to make it so that it's the state's responsibility to regulate our business. Well, think of it like this. If I'm out there and the big money these days is in, I don't know, anti-Semitic ice cream shops, And all of these anti-Semitic ice cream shops are using their anti-Semitism to make huge bucks. And I'm the only one who's not doing it, right? Then there creates an incentive for me to act anti-Semitically in order to maximize my own profits. If I'm working in the marketplace, I'd be failing my shareholders by not having an anti-Semitic ice cream shop. So you shouldn't blame me. You should make better laws to regulate business to make it so that we are not allowed to have anti-Semitic ice cream shops. And so therefore bring balance to the economy through regulation and allow us to act morally. Otherwise, I'll fail, right? Okay. So this whole response relies on an ideal of the free market as justifying a notion of corporate social responsibility or a view of corporate social responsibility. But many of us take the idea of free markets for granted. But if the ideal of a free market is going to justify the economic view of corporate social responsibility, then we need to examine that ideal if we're to evaluate the economic view at all. Now, what do we mean by a free market here? Well, by a free market, we basically mean a market that is unimpeded by certain actions from the public and by regulations from the government. Now, the economic view is not asking for an absolutely free market. The economic view is asking for a market that is regulated in certain ways by the state, but otherwise free. Okay? So when we talk about a free market, we're not necessarily talking about an absolutely free market. That's kind of an abstract ideal. It's not clear that it's ever been realized in the first place. We're talking about this kind of free market within certain limitations. Okay. But there are two basic models for justifying the free market that we're going to talk about. The first is what we might call the utility model, based on utilitarian ethics. And the second is the rights model, based on a more deontological or right or moral rights-based argument, view of morality. So to determine if the qualified economic view's legalistic response, the response we just considered, is adequate, we have to evaluate whether these models provide sufficient justification for the economic view in the first place. So let's start with the utility model. What approach justifies the free market on basically utilitarian grounds? Utilitarians hold that something is morally justified insofar as it can be expected to make things go best for everyone, basically. We discussed the specifics of moral utilitarianism a little bit more last week. For now, that's good enough to work with. So the claim is free markets are the best at providing for everyone. When we have healthy free markets, most people's needs are met by interacting with the marketplace. And economic growth will correlate to an increase in people's overall well-being. So we have kind of two justifications here, right? Most people's needs will be met, and be met most efficiently, and be met most robustly through free exchange in a free market. If I have to go and get vouchers every time I need to get food, it's going to be way less efficient than if I am, in general, have some salary and I'm able to go and interact in the market directly and pay for my food freely, and so on and so forth, such is the claim. And likewise, economic growth in general will lead to an increase in everyone's well-being through reinvestment and through growth and through taxation for certain schemes, state schemes if necessary. The idea kind of justifies itself in this way. Look at all the good that free markets have given us. Look at all the innovative science. Look at all the engineering and design and breakthroughs in social organization and new technologies to communicate, travel, learn, and live life in general. Those things have been in part created by the free market as an economic structure. And so when we look at those things, we think, yeah, those are basically good developments. So maybe having free markets is a good way to maximize these things. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily true. You might look at these claims and think, actually, some of those are questionable. We are a little bit too ready to attribute innovative approaches to ideas to free market forces. That's a question for another time. Right now, we're just considering what is this justification that the utility model presents, that utilitarians present for a free market, and we can critique it later. So, according to the utility model of free markets, we need a robustly free market, a market without or with limited government intervention. We need a robustly free market economy because that is necessary to maximize utility. On this view, those who act on behalf of businesses are playing a specific role in society, maximize shareholder profits. When they play this role, they're doing their job to contribute to a system that, when functioning correctly, will maximize the good for a society. So the idea is this. We have these groups of people, corporations, and they act on behalf of the shareholders within that structure. And when they do so to maximize shareholder profit, they're going to be contributing to the system that, when functioning correctly, will maximize the good for society. Okay? So over time, that's the result that's expected according to the utility model. But there's a problem with this claim. There's a problem with this argument, and that is the general problem of market failures. Okay? The utility model for justifying free market economies relies on the claim that a well-functioning free market will tend to meet the needs of consumers and or to raise overall welfare in a society. The problem is that there are many ways in which markets can fail to meet consumer needs, even in cases where those markets are free and flourishing. If that's the case, and a free market system will fail to maximize utility, then the utilitarian defense of the free market ideal may not justify the economic view of corporate social responsibility. That is to say, if it's the case that markets, when left on their own, are not going to tend to increase welfare overall, then that's going to be a problem for the economic view, because the economic view relies, or this version of the economic view relies, on that utilitarian justification of free markets. And there are a number of problems that are created. There are a number of market failures. So the first kind of market failure is what we call a negative externality. A negative externality is basically a bad consequence of a functioning market. That is, a bad consequence of a functioning market that is a byproduct of that market functioning well. Okay? So it is, in fact, a byproduct of the market doing what it's supposed to do. For example, groundwater pollution, air pollution, failure to dispose of waste, destruction of forests. Often, the most efficient and cost-saving ways, that is, the best way of maximizing shareholder value, is to get rid of waste is just to buy some land and dump it there. But this can cause serious harm to others and to their environments. The costs of such byproducts of the market are borne by people other than market actors, individual citizens or groups, as well as people in other countries. So what's the idea here? The problem of negative externalities is this. If it's supposed to be the case that a free market system is justified on utilitarian grounds, then because the market is going to tend to provide for people, then market actors are going to then start to bear moral responsibilities, because acting on shareholder interests is going to cause harm to people other than the shareholders and the direct actors in the business. It's not management at the chemical company who gets hurt when they dump a bunch of chemicals at a nearby park. It's the people who use the park. This is the problem of negative externalities. There's also, famously, the market failure that pertains to what we might call the problem of public goods. So a public good is something, typically a service, which everyone benefits from, but which the market cannot be expected to provide. Public goods include things like police, firefighters, roadways, and city cleaners. Even though everyone benefits from these services when they're run properly, there's no way to get a straightforward market price which everyone can share. We can't look at the firefighters and say, how much is it worth paying to have a firefighting service? Because it's impossible to calculate the exact economic, calculation for what is rational to pay, for what individual actors to be rational to pay. So the general problem of public goods, the reason that the market can't be expected to provide public goods is because, one, there's no way to provide the service for only those who pay for it. That is, there's no way to have a firefighting force or roadways or city cleaners that only help those who are consumers of the city cleaner service. It's just not a service that would work in that kind of way. Imagine sewers, right? Sewers run to every house. You can't really have a sewage system, a public sewage system. You can't have public restrooms. You can't have things like that. If you're only going to allow people who pay towards it to work on it because they're, by their nature, public. And second, there's no mechanism which the market can provide this service to all who need it and would be expected to benefit from it, especially the poor, right? We think the market exists to help people meet their needs. Well, people need protection. They need firefighters, they need roadways, and they need city cleaners. But there's no way for the market to produce a mechanism which will allow this to exist for everyone who needs it if you do a direct payment system. This is especially bad for the poor and the impoverished, those who maybe most badly need these services. Thus, there are needs which the free market can't meet. But one reply to the persistence of negative externalities and to the needs for public good is that the state should be permitted to regulate businesses. So the utility model suggests that we should have free markets to the extent that regulations and the provision of public goods allow. This is what the economic view already accepted, right? Surely they can ask, aren't regulations enough? Surely then, they might say, the economic model can work. Businesses can act on shareholder interests within the regulations produced by the state. Right? Why wouldn't they be able to? Surely, however, we can ask the question, aren't regulations enough to deal with the problem of public goods and the problem of negative externalities? One reply to the persistence of negative externalities and to the need for public goods is that the state should be permitted to regulate business through maintenance and the acquisition of tax dollars. The utility model suggests that we should have free markets to the extent that regulations and the provision of public goods allow. So surely then, the economic view can work. Businesses can act on shareholder interests within the regulations produced by the state. Isn't it sufficient, then, the claim is, that we have regulations in the business world? Wouldn't that solve the issue of corporate social responsibility? Well, the problem is that the problem of public goods and the problem of negative externalities are compounded by a final problem, a final kind of market failure. That is the problem of perverse incentives. So the third and final form of market failure is what we call a perverse incentive. Perverse incentives are incentives to act in a certain way that we regard as morally bad or unjust. Imagine we're at dinner. I know you're extremely likely to offer to pay. Indeed, if you don't offer, our third friend almost certainly will. Thus, I know there's very little chance that I'll need to pay for my meal. I might, out of concern for you or our friend, order something modest and affordable, knowing that you're going to plan to pay. But I might, acting on my own self-interest, order something huge and exorbitant. From the perspective of my rational self-interest, given that the exorbitant meal will not be bad for me and will make me happy, there's an incentive to order that, since I'll bear no cost for it. Now, I know I should have a modest meal, but I'm incentivized to act on my own self-interest, that is, to act against what I know morally I ought to do. We call this a perverse incentive, an incentive to act against our moral judgment, or against what ought to be our moral judgment. And there are two perverse incentives that are at play widely in the business world, right? And which create issues for the kind of justification for the economic view that we've been discussing. The first is that businesses are incentivized to find loopholes in extant regulations. And the second is that businesses are incentivized to lobby lawmakers to loosen or prevent new regulations. The idea is this: businesses are out there in the world. They're not abstractions existing in these abstract markets. Businesses are concrete entities that have money, that are powerful, that work in the world. And if their only responsibility is to maximize shareholder value, then there exists incentives for them to find whatever loopholes exist in the extant regulation, the extant regulative structure, where a loophole is basically a way of breaking the rule anyway, but not getting hurt for it because I'm skating by on a technicality. And furthermore, businesses, as some of the most powerful entities in a society, are incentivized to use their money to lobby lawmakers to loosen or prevent new regulations. And so there exist perverse incentives for businesses to get close to lawmakers and to use their money to prevent new regulations that ought to exist. And so this would seem to make it insufficient for the legalistic approach to work, for the approach to work that just relies on the regulative structure. The regulative structure, the legalistic approach, relies only on the ideal that lawmakers will be independent and that loopholes will not exist. But we know historically that lawmakers can't be independent. In fact, there's no way to completely insulate lawmakers from the risks of manipulation or insider trading and the like. And we know from experience that loopholes are always going to be found in the law. For example, Walmart has engaged in extensive union busting. When regulations against union busting have occurred, Walmart has turned to new and more creative methods of union busting. For example, hiring private contractors filled with undocumented workers to avoid paying the full price for janitorial services. By doing this, Walmart does not have a workforce that is capable of unionizing for their janitorial service. They hire businesses that are external and of people with questionable legal status, so that those people won't be emboldened to engage in unionizing activities together. So this utility model doesn't seem to justify the economic view. If the utility model is the right model for for justifying the ideal of a free market, then it's going to have to allow for some mechanisms to combat the existence of perverse incentives, public goods, or to create public good, to secure public goods, and to minimize the existence of negative externalities, which will in fact not end up looking like a justification for the economic view that all the moral responsibility is to maximize profits. Second, we have, after the utility model, we have what we might call the rights model for justifying a free market economy. This is another very influential model. According to the rights model, free markets are the best way to preserve our right to our property. So free markets are in a way to secure our freedoms, our individual rights. On this view, a marketplace of exchange, fairly regulated and free from interference, is necessary to protect a person's rights to their personal property. In the free market, I can freely exchange my property for your services, currency, or for other property that I desire. As a result, the idea is the free market preserves our freedom as individual economic agents. So according to the rights model of the free market economy, the ideal of a free market exists to preserve individual freedoms. As such, when you act on behalf of the shareholders, it is their freedom who you act to preserve. You are exchanging their property in the marketplace. Thus, the modified economic view of corporate responsibility is morally justified within extant regulations because it's the only way to respect the rights of everyone within the marketplace. Right? Well, the problem with this view is what we might call the problem of other rights. Right? The problem is that it's not clear that this view justifies the economic view in the first place. While there is some case to be made that the utilitarian view seems to justify a version of the economic view, at least on the surface, it's not at all clear that a view that of free markets as freedom-preserving institutions for exchange does this at all. The problem is this: there are many other rights that we must think about when making ethical decisions. The economic view would only be justified if we had a special reason to think that property rights were privileged in such a way that they ought to take priority over other relevant rights. That is to say, in the marketplace, our actions are going to impact other people's rights. Someone's right to life, for example, even if I'm trading in medicine, or someone's right to free association or freedom of movement if I'm dealing in real estate or property. Other people's rights to a clean home or whatnot. These are all things that are that the property right that property rights can come to conflict with within the free market, within exchange within the free market. So the only reason to think that the economic view would be justified on the basis of a rights-preserving or freedom-preserving justification of the market is if property rights were privileged in such a way that they ought to take priority over other relevant rights in all cases. But there is no justification for this. For example, an employee's right to fair wages and surrounding residents' right to safe homes may sometimes create obstacles for a business. If my employees have a right to fair wages, I have to pay them more, and that's going to require that I not maximize shareholder value if I want to respect that right. Likewise, surrounding residents might have a right to safe homes, which means that my right to maximize shareholder profits might be in conflict with this right in such cases where I just want to dump my chemicals in their backyard. Does this mean that businesses should simply be permitted to ignore the rights that are non-property rights? Well, only if property rights are somehow more important than anything else. And we don't really have any strong reasons for thinking that that's the case. Now, an alternative to the shareholder or economic model is what we might call the stakeholder model. Because there appear to be considerable challenges for the shareholder market, the shareholder view of corporate social responsibility, many people came together, argued for a long time, and developed what came to be known as the stakeholder model. In response to this view, many ethicists turned to the stakeholder model as a more promising view. According to the stakeholder model, businesses have obligations not merely to shareholders, though they do have obligations to shareholders, but to everyone who has a stake in the actions of a business. The idea is this: businesses are more than just shareholder capital. They rely on laborers, suppliers, social infrastructure, and markets. Each of these relationships, not just the relationship with shareholders, requires special ethical attention. The actions of businesses impact all kinds of people, and so businesses have moral responsibilities to all kinds of people. And they have duties, special duties, especially to, yes, their shareholders, the capital, but also to their workers, to the people to the other businesses with whom they engage in supply, to social infrastructure like roads, utility services, but also like social media and other kinds of social infrastructures, and to markets themselves. And so there are obligations that are grounded in all of these relationships that a business holds to the world around it. So according to the stakeholder model, a business's decisions impact many different people, and many people have moral claims on the business, meaning they can reasonably make ethical requests of the business, like, don't pour your chemicals in my backyard. As a result, ethical business practice ethical business practice requires that we balance the interests of various parties. Sometimes a duty to shareholders will take priority, but sometimes a duty to workers will take priority. Who receives priority when will depend on specific contextual details, general principles about the priorities of our business faces, and general ethical ideas about which values are relevant and when. But many think that, while many people think that the stakeholder model provides a more promising model of business ethics, it still faces problems. One major problem that has been talked about for this stakeholder model is that it can sometimes be difficult to tell who the stakeholders are in a given context. This is because it can be hard to tell in advance who will be impacted by a business's actions. As such, critics may be concerned that the stakeholder model is impractical, useless, or unhelpful. But as an ethical theory, the stakeholder model is supposed to advise us on how to act, practically speaking. But proponents of the stakeholder model are likely to point out that while we may sometimes be unable to tell who will be impacted in advance, sometimes we do know, and we can almost always list some people who will be impacted. But proponents can also point to a similar practical issue that's faced by the economic view. Just as we cannot always tell who will be impacted by a business's actions, it's impossible to always tell how the markets will react to those actions. That is, it's impossible to determine how we will actually maximize shareholder profits in the first place. So the economic view faces the same kind of indeterministic issue with regard to practical advice. As such, it's equally impossible to tell which actions will ultimately maximize profits, and thus unclear how the shareholder or the stakeholder view, the economic view, would advise us how to act without more contextual details. We need more contextual details to do ethics about basically any case, is the claim that's going on here. Which is why so many of the cases we'll discuss and have discussed have so much detail. The nuance matters, the individual aspects of the cases really matter for determining how we do ethical analysis. All right, finally, this week for your discussion post, I want you to talk about Walmart's healthcare policies. You can read the case from the beginning of Chapter 3 to get a little bit more detail on this again. But basically, it starts from the case. In 2005, internal Walmart memos documented 2 strategies to avoid paying healthcare-related labor costs. First, find ways to avoid employing unhealthy, older, or obese employees. And 2, increase the proportion of part-time laborers who do not qualify for health benefits. In this memo, Walmart acknowledged that 46% of children of their employees were on Medicaid or were uninsured due to Walmart's low wages. Many people found Walmart's practices to be thereby unethical. My question for you today is, how would the different theories of corporate social responsibility we discussed today in this lecture, that is, the shareholder/economic model and the stakeholder model, evaluate Walmart's actions? Which theory seems the most plausible to you? Now, I want to give a little hint here. It's not the case that the economic model is, or the economic view, as I called it throughout the slides, is just necessarily going to say that Walmart's actions are perfectly okay. Remember, the economic view might have different ways of condemning things. It might have different ways of arguing that Walmart shouldn't have done what they in fact did do. Nevertheless, I want you to figure out, in general, what you think the shareholder view might say. Maybe it would approve of Walmart's actions. I just don't think it's a clear case. Maybe the stakeholder model, what would it say? I want you to think about what both of these theories would say. Tell us what both of these different theories would say briefly, and then explain which of these theories seems best to you and why. All right. I'll be back next week. For next week, I want you to read Chapter 5 in Desjardins' textbook, and make sure this week that you watch that 4-sentence essay video. Your 4-sentence essays will be due next week. Thank you very much, and have a good day.